Good morning. In the story of Abram, where we are, our children's church is, our children's class and teen class are, we find ourselves in sort of a poignant moment. This chapter introduces us to a person named Hagar. There are many things that we might notice about Hagar, but at least these three. She is an enslaved person. She is a woman. She is an immigrant. And so she is, in lots of ways, a person without power. She has endured a tremendously difficult circumstance. And she has fled back towards her childhood home when we find her at one point in this text. And it's in this wilderness place as she's striving to get back to her ancestral home that God appears to her in the form of an angel. She has a divine encounter in this place. And in this place, she describes God with two Hebrew words, El Roi. El Roi. Everybody say that. El Roi, the God who sees. This is the only time in the Hebrew Bible when God is specifically called El Roi. Of course, there are a lot of times when God sees what's happening, but here, a woman, an immigrant, an enslaved person, says, "This is the God who sees." And that seems very significant to me. It is interesting, however, that in the context of recognizing this is El Roi, the God who sees me, Hagar is also led to ask a question. This is translated so many different ways depending on what translation you're reading. The meaning of the question is a bit uncertain in the NRSV updated edition. Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? It seems to be a question driven by some anxiety. And we might wonder why. Why, after encountering El Roi, the God who sees her, why would she be led to ask a question undergirded by some anxiety? And I wonder, does Hagar fear that God sees her in the way that almost everyone else in her life sees her? A few years ago, I watched this show on TV, and it was about a soldier named Stripe. And at first I thought it was a horror show, like a Halloween horror show, because Stripe is serving in an army. All the soldiers speak English, but it's not necessarily an American army. They're sort of in a nondescript countryside. And they've been tasked with clearing out the surrounding villages, clearing them out of these grotesque, terrifying, humanoid-looking monsters. They look like they walked out of a nightmare. And after the soldiers overcome their initial fear about these creatures inhabiting the villages and the countryside, they are able to clear them out quickly. Everybody wants these creatures gone, and so killing them is easy for these soldiers to do. Until something seems to be going wrong with Stripe. He seems to be seeing things that really aren't there, and so he goes back to his base and he meets with the medical professionals on base. They give him a thorough exam, and they discover that there's something wrong with his neural implant. This is taking place sometime in the future, and when you enlist in this army in that future, you're forced to receive this neural implant. And this neural implant does something special that the soldiers don't know that it does. Using very sophisticated software, the neural implant makes it so that when the soldiers see the enemy What they see is a terrifying, monstrous creature. And it makes it much easier for the soldiers to eliminate them without hesitation, without remorse. But of course, what Stripe actually is seeing in front of him is a living human being. Someone who is just like him. And that's the real rub, isn't it? And it is one thing to see, it's another to see. And so I wonder, is Hagar wondering what God sees when he looks at her? Because at least up to this point in her story, when virtually everyone else looks at her, what they see is something less than human. We're told that she's from Egypt. She's not in Egypt right now. We don't know why. Maybe we could speculate what's happened in her life. Perhaps she went through some terrible circumstances back home. Perhaps she was a very poor person back home, and so she's left home because she has nothing else to do. And I wonder, how did people back home see her? Did they know her as Hagar? Or back home, was she just, oh, that poor woman? Oh, you know, that person for whom everything's gone wrong. And now she's enslaved. Yes, slavery in the ancient world was different than slavery in American history, but it is still slavery. She no longer belongs to herself, and we might speculate about how that's happened and why she finds herself in this situation. But we don't really have to speculate about the way those who have enslaved her see her. At this point in the story, Abram and Sarai are in a challenging space. About 10 years ago, God appeared to them and said, I'm going to make a great nation of you. I'm going to give you a great name, and I'm going to, through you, bless all the families of the earth. And now Abram and Sarai are old. There are no children there of which to make a great nation. And so Abram and Sarai decide to use Hagar. There's no sensitive, careful sitting down with Hagar and explaining the situation. And we were wondering, Hagar, if you could do us the honor, the tremendous honor of being a surrogate. There's none of that. There's just two people in power using a person not in power. And notice how Abram and Sarai speak about Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. Then Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. There's no calling Hagar by her name. There's really not even speaking to Hagar. There's just speaking about Hagar. And of course, this situation creates tension in the home. It's no wonder there's special tension between Sarai and Hagar. And Sarai is as much to blame for this as Abram is. Hagar finds herself in an unspeakably difficult situation. And so finally, the slave is tossed out like garbage, tossed out with just the clothes on her back, tossed out with the baby in her belly. And she begins walking. She begins walking back home, and we find her in this wilderness, Bir Lahai Roi, between Hebron and Egypt. And it's here that she finally has this divine encounter. Can you see how Hagar's been seen, and can you see why she might have some anxiety about God seeing her? It reminds me a little bit of the scene in the Gospels when Jesus is eating dinner at the house of a man named Simon, and into this setting comes a woman, and Simon sees her as a sinful woman, and Jesus presses back with this question. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman?" Of course Simon sees this woman, but he doesn't really see this woman. I think there are so many ways in which, like Hagar, many of us move through our own lives misseen. Many of us move through our own lives unseen. Ralph Ellison took a stab at this in his novel, The Invisible Man. This is not the H.G. Wells novel, The Invisible Man, about the person who creates technology to literally be invisible. This is about a man who's so invisible, he's not even named in the narrative, but he's invisible, he's unseen because of his ethnicity. And so growing up in high school and then in college, he's treated very poorly by the people that are around him. He moves to New York City and even there experiences a certain kind of invisibility. And at one point in the novel, he says, "I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me." And this is Hagar. And this is many of us, misseen by people, unseen by people. But the good news of our text this morning is that this woman, Hagar, misseen by many, unseen by many, is truly, fully seen by God. And in this story, we know that this is a good thing, because God, the one who sees her, El Roi, is also the one who calls her by name. So notice the exchange. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur, and he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" Those closest to her simply know her as slave, but the God who sees her knows her by name. He is the God who sees. And in this story, to be seen is the very best thing of all. And it tells us that you too are seen, fully seen by God. As the treasured human that you are, one of the most powerful images of God is the image that we find in this text, El Roi, the God who sees. There's a very interesting psychological experiment conducted a few years ago. Participants were asked to take a sheet of paper on which were just rows and rows of letters. No words, just rows and rows of letters. And they were asked to find the 10 times when 2 letters occurred side by side. So YY, AA, DD, 10 of those. And then once they found those, they could turn that sheet in and get paid for it. And then if they wanted to, they could get another sheet and find 10 more, turn it in, and get paid. And what the experimenters wanted to find out is how long would people keep that up? the sort of monotonous task. How long would people endure that? Unbeknownst to the participants, they divided the participants up into 3 groups. And so the first group we might call the acknowledged group. So if you're in the acknowledged group, you've got your sheet, AA, XX, YY. You find the 10 examples of the 2 letters back to back. You circle them. You bring them up to the person that's running the experiment in this room. The person looks up for what they're doing. They acknowledge you. They take your sheet, they scan it, and then they file it. And then they pay you for that sheet. And then you're free to do it again if you want to. That's the acknowledged group. And then there's another group called the ignored group. And if you were in the ignored group, you'd have your sheet, you're sitting down, you're going through BB, YY, ZZ, you got the 10, you bring it up to the person that's running the experiment. They don't look up at you at all. They don't acknowledge your presence at all. They just take your sheet. They don't scan it. They just file it away. They pay you. You can go back and do it again if you want to. The third group is the shredded group. If you're in this group, you got your sheet, you're sitting down, you're going through the letters TT, SS, MN, N, O, B, B, and you got the 10, you bring it up. They don't acknowledge you at all. The person running the experiment just takes the sheet from you, doesn't say anything to you, puts it immediately into the shredder, and pays you your money. You can go back and do it again if you want to. Can you guess which group endured the longest in the experiment? Yeah, the acknowledged group. Interestingly, the shredded group actually had the most potential motivation to keep on keeping on. Because in reality, no one was checking their work. And no one is going to check it because it's just going straight into the shredder. I mean, you could have sat down, circled nothing, just count to 10, bring it up, get it shredded, get your money, sit down, 10 seconds, bring it up. You could do that all day long. But they gave up. Interestingly, the ignored group and the shredded group had no differences in terms of the average amount of time that they stayed with the task. In other words, to be ignored is just as bad as having your work shredded. It was the acknowledged group that had the capacity to stay with the task. It is in being acknowledged, it is in being seen that we find strength, that we find resilience, that we find the capacity to endure what sometimes can be very difficult to endure. And this is true with Hagar. It's because she met the God who sees her that she was able to go back into this extraordinarily difficult circumstance. It is because God sees you and adores the one he sees that gives you strength every day to keep doing what is before you. Would you join me in saying the words of this brief, simple prayer out loud? God, you are El Roi. This is what fills me with joy. God, you are the one who sees. This is what sets me free. I now have strength to continue because I know I am seen by you.